Have you ever wondered who truly owns America? Not in the patriotic sense of flags and slogans, but in the real economy. In land deeds, stock shares, bonds, and increasingly, in the invisible streams of data. Beneath the surface, the United States is a story of concentrated ownership. Land controlled by a handful of families, corporations owned by a few asset managers, trillions in debt held by foreign creditors, and entire industries dominated by a small circle of firms. This concentration shapes not just wealth, but life itself, from jobs and healthcare to the shrinking promise of the American dream. The American dream in crisis. Who really owns America in 2025? Let's break it down. Land. The first source of power. Land was America's original currency of power. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 gave railroad companies 174 million acres of land, roughly the size of Texas. This laid the foundation for dynasties that mixed economic control with political influence. Today, land ownership is still concentrated in strikingly few hands. Emerson family, 2.4 million acres. John Malone, 2.2 million acres. Bill Gates, more than 270,000 acres of farmland. Collectively, the top 100 landowners hold over 40 million acres, larger than the state of Florida. For ordinary Americans, however, land is harder to own than ever. Home prices have surged 120% since 2000, while wages barely moved. Millennials own just 4% of U.S. real estate wealth, compared with baby boomers who held 32% at the same age. If land was once the foundation of the American dream, how many can still afford a piece of it? While land defined the 19th century, Wall Street defines today. Just three firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, manage about $23 trillion, equivalent to the entire GDP of the US and China combined. They are the largest shareholders in 90% of the S&P 500, including Apple, Amazon, ExxonMobil, and JP Morgan Chase. These firms don't run the companies day-to-day, but they control how boards vote, how CEOs are paid, and even what policies corporations adopt on climate or labor. And while these giants accumulate trillions, ordinary Americans struggle. The median household wealth in 2022 was just $192,900, while the top 1% owned more than 32% of all wealth. Half of Americans cannot cover a $1,000 emergency expense without debt. Debt is another layer of control. America's $34 trillion national debt is financed by a mix of domestic investors, the Federal Reserve, and foreign creditors. For decades, China and Japan were among the largest holders of U.S. treasuries. But in the past 2 years, China has been dumping U.S. bonds to their lowest levels in more than a decade, and Japan has followed suit. That means America's lenders are pulling away. Rising interest rates have already increased borrowing costs on everything from student loans to mortgages, leaving households squeezed. The average U.S. credit card interest rate has climbed above 20%, the highest in decades, while household debt has crossed $17.5 trillion. Debt no longer just funds wars and highways. It dictates the lives of ordinary families, whether they can buy a house, send a child to college, or even pay for health care. In the 21st century, ownership isn't just about land or money, it's about data. Tech giants like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Meta hold more than 175 zettabytes of global data. That's information about where you go, what you buy, and what you think. This new data feudalism gives them immense predictive power. Shoshana Zuboff calls it surveillance capitalism, where human behavior itself becomes raw material for profit. And the US government admits it's dependent on this infrastructure. The Pentagon relies on Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure for military cloud operations. If the 19th century belonged to railroad barons and the 20th century to bankers, the 21st century belongs to data barons. Ownership extends beyond land and data into the very stories Americans tell themselves. Just 5 corporations, Disney, Comcast, Paramount, Fox, and Warner Bros. Discovery, dominate the media landscape. They shape news, entertainment, and the political narrative. Ben Bagdikian warned in The New Media Monopoly that democracy cannot thrive when the flow of information is so tightly controlled. Today, social media platforms amplify that concentration, with algorithms designed not to inform, but to maximize profit. All these forms of ownership converge in one outcome: inequality. The top 1% of Americans control about 32% of wealth, while the bottom 50% hold just 2.5%. Median household income in 2022 was about $74,000, but real wages have barely grown in 40 years. 37 million Americans live in poverty, including 1 in 6 children. Nearly 30 million people remain uninsured or underinsured, despite healthcare costs averaging over $13,000 per person annually. The average U.S. life expectancy, at 76 years, now lags behind most developed countries. Meanwhile, economic mobility, once the essence of the American dream, has stalled. Studies by Raj Chetty and colleagues show that only 50% of children today will earn more than their parents, compared with 90% for those born in 1940. So is the American dream still alive? For some, yes, but for millions, it is slipping further away. If ownership equals power, then America's future depends on how that ownership is shared. Policy options are not lacking. Antitrust reforms to break up monopolies in finance, tech, and media. Progressive taxation to ensure billionaires and corporations contribute fairly. Public investment in housing, healthcare, and education to restore mobility. Land transparency and regulation to prevent extreme concentration. Data rights legislation to give citizens control over their digital footprint. Labor empowerment to ensure that workers share in productivity gains, not just executives and shareholders. None of these changes are easy. Each threatens entrenched interests, but without them, inequality will deepen and ownership will continue to drift into fewer hands. So, who really owns America? A small group of mega landlords own its soil. A few Wall Street giants own its corporations. Foreign creditors hold its debt, though they are slowly retreating. Tech titans own its data. Media conglomerates own its stories. And in the end, the ordinary American owns less and less. Of land, of wealth, of security, and of the dream that once defined the nation. Ownership is not just about property. It is about power. And power is never shared freely. The question for America is whether it can reclaim ownership for the many, or whether the future will be dictated by the few. If you found this valuable, please subscribe, like, comment, and share. Thanks for watching.